The commotion at the fete grew into a swelling, feverish hum that carried across the lawn, echoing off the hedgerows and unsettling the nesting sparrows. Miss Marple remained where she stood for a moment, letting the tide of frantic movement wash around her. She had always found that people in a panic behaved much like startled birds, fluttering without aim, making noise for noise's sake, accomplishing very little. Only when the initial burst of shock had been spent did she ease forward, slipping through the crowd with surprising grace for someone of her years. Mrs. Regina Harborough had been helped to her feet by two of the village ladies, though she still trembled violently. Her gloved hands were clutched at her breast, as though she feared her heart might leap out with fright if she loosened her grip. Her eyes, normally so poised and distant, were wide with horror as they stared at Adrian Brent's still form on the grass. The gentleman who only minutes before had drawn curious glances was now little more than a grim curiosity himself. Inspector Arkwright arrived shortly thereafter, summoned from the fete's small police booth at an uncharacteristically brisk trot. He was a stocky man, florid of face and perpetually irritated by situations that did not resolve themselves neatly. His arrival brought a momentary hush, for the villagers liked to believe that authority, once present, might restore order in their world. "What's all this, then?" he asked gruffly, leaning over the body with a frown. His eyes narrowed at the sprig of dark, glossy leaves pinned to the victim's chest. "You, is it? Nasty stuff. Not something one handles lightly." He glanced up, gaze sweeping the semicircle of onlookers. "Right. Everyone keep back. No trampling about. We'll need statements." Miss Marple, who had seen you used for terrible purposes before, folded her hands neatly before her. She did not intrude upon the inspector's early examination. She never did. The police, she believed, always needed a moment to form their initial, usually misguided opinions. And people, when observed just after a shock, revealed far more than they intended. She noticed Mrs. Holcombe sobbing into her handkerchief, though Miss Marple suspected that the vicar's wife was crying more from the horror of tragedy at her beloved fate than from any particular affection for the deceased. Young Timothy Gable, who had been manning the lemonade table, stood pale as a sheet and entirely useless. Mrs. Lacey, on the other hand, watched everything with unabashed interest, no doubt already cataloguing details for the village rumor mill. But it was Mrs. Harborough who held Miss Marple's attention most firmly. The widow pressed a trembling handkerchief to her lips. Her face, though drained of color, held a peculiar expression, one that hovered somewhere between shock and disbelief, as if she were struggling to accept something long feared. She swayed slightly, and one of the ladies supporting her murmured something meant to soothe. Inspector Arkwright approached her at once. "Madam, I understand you knew the deceased?" Yes," Mrs. Harborough whispered. Her voice quavered, though the words themselves came quickly, almost automatically. "Adrian was a friend, an old friend. He came to visit me just this morning." The inspector nodded curtly. "Did he appear unwell?" "No, not at all," she said, shaking her head too vigorously. "He was perfectly fine. We walked the grounds of Elmwood House. He seemed happy, content. And then—" Her breath hitched and the handkerchief went back to her mouth. A convenient reaction, Miss Marple thought. Not insincere, but perhaps not wholly spontaneous. Arkwright continued briskly. "You didn't see him collapse?" "No. I was by the charity table, speaking with Mrs. Greeley. Adrian said he wanted to take a short walk. He said the gardens here reminded him of something." Her brow furrowed faintly. "I didn't ask what." "Anything else unusual?" he pressed. Mrs. Harborough hesitated for a heartbeat too long. "No," she finally said. "Nothing." Miss Marple's blue eyes softened in something like sympathy. People often believed that deception required bold lies. In truth, it was the tiny pauses that gave them away. The inspector turned to the crowd. "Right, the rest of you. Anyone see Mr. Brent just before he fell?" A murmur rippled through the assembly. A few voices rose with vague claims. Someone had spotted him by the rose bushes, another swore he'd seen him near the raffle table, though the speaker admitted he'd not been paying proper attention at the time. Two children insisted they had heard a strange noise, but when questioned further, they could not agree on what the noise had been, nor where it came from. Miss Marple listened quietly, her head tilted slightly as if each word settled into its proper place within her thoughts. She noticed a curious thing. Though many villagers claimed to have seen Adrian Brent, no one mentioned seeing anyone else near him. In a small place filled with so many gossiping eyes, such a detail was most instructive. She moved gently toward the body once the inspector stepped back to confer with his constable. She did not touch anything, merely observed. The yew sprig in particular caught her attention, neatly pinned, purposefully placed. It was not a token of panic, it was a signature. Yew was symbolic as well as deadly, associated with mourning, with graves, with the older English tales of revenge and retribution. Whoever put it there wanted something understood. And yet the victim's expression, frozen in final surprise, suggested he had not expected death at all. That, too, was useful. A faint breeze stirred the leaves overhead, carrying the mingled scents of tea cakes, blossoms, and something darker, a warning of the storm building beneath the village's calm surface. As Miss Marple stepped back, she caught the eye of young Clara Pennington, a maid from Elmwood House who had accompanied Mrs. Harborough earlier. Clara bit her lip and looked away quickly, her face flushed. Guilt, fear, or simply anxiety at finding herself entangled in something dreadful. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with her later. Inspector Arkwright raised his voice again. "No one leaves until we've taken your statements, and if anyone knows of any quarrels, disagreements, anything at all regarding Mr. Brent, you bring it to me directly." This pronouncement caused an immediate ripple. Quarrels were the chief currency of Little Brynford, and many residents suddenly remembered long-forgotten fragments of information. Miss Marple, however, remained still. She had heard enough for now. The truth of the matter was already forming its outline in her mind. Not the solution, but the shape of the problem, the pattern behind the chaos. Patterns, she always believed, were far more honest than people. Her gaze drifted once more to the distant silhouette of Elmwood House, standing against the pale afternoon sky. The great mansion looked utterly peaceful, yet beneath its stately facade lay a history she suspected was anything but calm. And Miss Marple, with quiet certainty, felt the first tremor of something far-reaching. This was no random tragedy at a village fete. It was the beginning of something long in the making, something that had now, at last, stepped out of the shadows. The inspector's attempts to herd the villagers into a semblance of order took time, for people in Little Brynford were not accustomed to murder, much less one committed in their midst at a cheerful garden fete. Statements were taken with varying degrees of accuracy, excitement, and embellishment. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the rectory lawn, the fete stands were dismantled in subdued silence. The children, once lively as sparrows, clung close to their parents. No one wanted to linger near the rose garden now, where Adrian Brent's body had finally been covered and removed. Miss Marple remained until the last of the formalities concluded. Inspector Arkwright had nodded to her politely but did not engage her for more than a perfunctory greeting. He was wary of her gentle insights, perhaps because they tended to prove his initial theories incorrect. She understood. Many men disliked the idea that a quiet spinster from St. Mary Mead might see what they could not. She bore no ill will for it. When at last the villagers began drifting homeward, whispering in tight clusters, Miss Marple approached Clara Pennington, who stood near one of the trestle tables packing away leftover biscuits. The girl's hands shook so much she nearly tore the paper wrapping. "You must be terribly tired, dear," Miss Marple said kindly, stepping beside her. Such a shock as this is quite enough to unsettle anyone. Clara startled, nearly dropping the tin she held. Oh, Miss Marple. Yes, it's been dreadful. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the spot where Mr. Brent had fallen. I can't stop thinking about it. It is very natural, Miss Marple murmured. I imagine you knew Mr. Brent only briefly? Clara hesitated. I only met him today, madam. He arrived at Elmwood House early this morning. Mrs. Harborough seemed very glad to see him. There was a slight emphasis on the word glad. Miss Marple noticed. I see, she said. And did you observe anything unusual during the day? Anything at all? The girl bit her lip. No, nothing. Only, well, Mrs. Harborough seemed nervous before he arrived. She asked me 3 times if the guest bedroom had been properly prepared. Then when he finally came, she relaxed, but only for a little. I didn't hear what they talked about, but from the way they spoke. Clara trailed off, realizing she had said too much. Miss Marple finished gently. You sensed some tension. Clara nodded, relief softening her expression now that Miss Marple had provided the words she dared not choose herself. Yes, that's it. Tension. Thank you, my dear, Miss Marple said. You've been quite helpful. Clara curtsied slightly and hurried off with her bundled biscuits, clearly eager to escape further questioning. Miss Marple watched her go, sensing that the girl had held something back. Not intentionally, but out of that instinctual caution servants often developed when their employers were involved. The evening drew in fully by the time Miss Marple made her way down the lane toward the village, moving at the gentle pace that afforded her time to think. Her mind sifted quietly through everything she had observed. Adrian Brent had been placed deliberately away from crowds just before his death. Someone had ensured privacy during a public event. Someone who knew the fete's layout, who knew how people behaved there. Someone who needed an unobserved moment. The yew sprig troubled her most. Symbolism could be a dangerous thing. It suggested a message, a private one, perhaps meant for someone specific. Yew was ancient, associated with sorrow and graves. Yes, but also with secrets that refused to die. The lamps of Little Brinford glowed softly as she approached the high street. Miss Marple paused near the green where Mrs. Lacey and Mrs. Holcombe spoke in hurried whispers, clearly too absorbed to notice her. Tell you, Mrs. Lacey insisted. There must have been something between them. Why else would a gentleman visit a widow in such haste? And just think how she nearly fainted at the sight of him lying there. Hester Briggs swore she looked more shocked than grief-stricken, which is suspicious in itself. Nonsense, Mrs. Holcombe said shakily. The poor woman probably saw him die. Miss Marple did not linger. Gossip was like quicksand. It slowed one down without offering anything solid. Instead, she crossed the village green and headed toward Elmwood House, its silhouette visible in the moonlight rising behind the treetops. She had no intention of snooping about the property, but she found that walking near a place often helped her understand it. Elmwood House loomed, elegant and silent, behind its wrought iron gates. The windows glimmered faintly, suggesting the household was awake despite the late hour. Miss Marple paused under a lamp-post. She considered what Clara had said, what Mrs. Harborough had not said, and the curious timing of Adrian Brent's arrival. It was rare for coincidences to appear at the precise moment a tragedy unfolded. Just as she prepared to turn back, the front door of Elmwood House opened, spilling a rectangle of golden light onto the gravel path. A figure stepped out, Mrs. Harborough herself. Seeing someone on the lane, she stiffened for a moment before recognizing Miss Marple. Miss Marple, she called softly, her voice carrying a note of weary desperation. I thought I saw someone. I can't seem to rest. Miss Marple approached the gate, her manner warm but not intrusive. That is quite understandable, my dear. These things weigh heavily on the heart. Mrs. Harborough gripped the gate with a trembling hand. "You were at the fete when it happened. You saw him, didn't you? Adrian?" There was an anguish in her voice that suggested a depth of emotion not yet acknowledged. "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "I saw him." The widow's gaze lifted to the dark treetops beyond. "He should never have come. I told him—" She stopped abruptly, realizing she had wandered into dangerous truth. "It doesn't matter now." "It may matter very much," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes steady. Mrs. Harborough inhaled shakily, then stepped back as though retreating from her own vulnerability. "I can't," she whispered. "Not tonight." She turned and hurried inside, closing the door firmly behind her. Miss Marple remained at the gate a moment longer, gazing at the silent house. There were secrets here, painful, tangled ones that had not yet fully surfaced. But they would. Secrets, like yew roots, had a way of forcing themselves upward through even the hardest soil. As she made her way home under the soft glow of the village lamps, Miss Marple knew with certainty that Adrian Brent's death was not an isolated act. It was part of something larger, something that had begun long before the fete and would reveal itself only when the right questions were asked of the right people. And she fully intended to ask them. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual the next morning, though sleep had not eluded her so much as circled her thoughts in a restless drift. The dawn light filtered gently through the lace curtains of her modest bedroom, casting delicate patterns on the quilt she had stitched many years ago. As she dressed, she found her mind returning again and again to Mrs. Harborough's haunted expression at the gate of Elmwood House. There was a woman carrying far more than shock. Burdened guilt had a particular look about it, different from remorse, different even from fear. It was the look of someone who believed a tragedy had been set in motion long before the rest of the world noticed. The village stirred slowly, still subdued after the previous day's events. People stepped out of their cottages with cautious glances, as if expecting misfortune to linger in the hedgerows. Miss Marple, however, walked with her usual measured pace toward the high street, intending to call at the grocer's, a habit that conveniently placed her at the heart of village conversation. And indeed she had hardly reached the first shop when Mrs. Lacey hurried toward her, breathless and eager. "Miss Marple, you'll never believe the latest," she exclaimed, as if delivering news of a comet sighting. "Inspector Arkwright came knocking on doors at dawn. He says the post-mortem suggests poison. Poison! Imagine that, here in Little Brinford." Miss Marple merely lifted her brows. It was hardly a revelation. The yew sprig alone had suggested as much, but she allowed Mrs. Lacey her moment. "Poison is a very troubling thing," Miss Marple said mildly, selecting a small jar of marmalade from the shelf. "It implies forethought, opportunity, and perhaps a degree of knowledge." "Exactly my thoughts," Mrs. Lacey said, though her sudden tone implied the thought had only now occurred to her. "And then there's Mrs. Harborough. Hester Briggs swears she saw her speaking rather heatedly with Mr. Brent near the rose garden just before everything happened." "Hester Briggs is rather fond of embellishing," Miss Marple replied. "She once insisted that Major Penfield kept a trained hawk in his attic." "That was never proven untrue," Mrs. Lacey argued with great importance. "But this is much more serious. They say Mr. Brent was a business acquaintance, though some whisper the connection was more personal." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "And you know what people are saying about her late husband, that he died under circumstances not entirely ordinary." Miss Marple had indeed heard such murmurs, though she placed little stock in gossip unsupported by fact. Still, the notion that Mrs. Harborough had experienced a sudden widowing only months before her arrival in Little Brinford was interesting. Too much tragedy compressed into one life often hinted at hidden fractures. "I think," Miss Marple said, handing the grocer her coins, "that many people are speaking far too soon." But even as she spoke the words, she could not ignore the tightening thread of unease surrounding Mrs. Harborough. And regarding Adrian Brent, the question was not simply who had killed him, but why he had come to Little Brentford at all. Leaving the shop, she continued her walk toward the green, where Inspector Arkwright stood giving orders to a young constable. He greeted her with a weary sigh. "Miss Marple, I suppose you've heard." "One can hardly avoid hearing when the entire village has decided to take up the work of sleuthing," she said with gentle humor. Arkwright snorted. "I'd settle for a village that minds its own business. This whole affair is complicated enough. Poisoning suggests premeditation, and the sprig of you—" He shook his head. "Shows a theatrical streak. We're not dealing with the usual." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "You certainly are not." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Between you and me, the widow is behaving oddly. Evasive, and she admitted to having a disagreement with the victim the very morning he arrived. Something about unresolved matters from her past." "Did she now?" Miss Marple said softly. It was exactly the sort of slip Mrs. Harborough would regret. Arkwright crossed his arms. "She didn't tell me much, just enough to make it clear there's more she's hiding, and I intend to get to the bottom of it." Miss Marple nodded. "I'm sure you will." But she knew that the inspector was unlikely to pry open the truth through force. Mrs. Harborough seemed the type to retreat deeper the more she was pressured. Human nature often needed a softer touch. As she took her leave, Miss Marple noticed someone loitering near the church gate. A thin man, impeccably dressed, though his suit seemed slightly ill-fitting on his narrow frame. He held a cigarette, tapping it nervously, but did not smoke it. His gaze darted toward Elmwood House, then away again. When he caught Miss Marple's eye, he quickly dropped the cigarette and strode off toward the inn. She tucked that observation away carefully. Returning home, Miss Marple brewed herself a cup of tea, the familiar ritual helping to order her thoughts. She considered the widow's agitation, Clara Pennington's nervousness, the inspector's suspicions, and this stranger who seemed to be waiting for something. Or someone. Most of all, she considered the peculiar confidence with which Adrian Brent had attended the fete. He had not seemed a man unwelcome or fearful. Rather, he had seemed assured, perhaps too assured, of his place in Mrs. Harborough's life. Yet he had died within the hour of arriving among the villagers. Miss Marple took a small sip of tea. If he had come to Little Brentford with expectations of reconciliation, of accusation, or of leverage, then someone had wanted to ensure those expectations never came to light. She sat quietly for a long moment, letting the steam curl upward from her cup like a whisper. Something at Elmwood House was festering beneath the polished surface, something long buried, now disturbed. And while Inspector Arkwright chased motives in the present, Miss Marple sensed the key lay in the past Mrs. Harborough feared, the past Adrian Brent had brought with him. The yew-sprig, symbolic and deliberate, was not merely a warning. It was a message from someone who believed old grievances never truly die. Miss Marple set aside her empty teacup and rose from her chair with the sense, not of urgency, but of steady purpose. She had always believed that mysteries, like embroidery patterns, revealed themselves best when examined stitch by stitch, and the next stitch, she felt certain, lay at Elmwood House itself. Not barging in, of course. She would never do something so improper, but in arriving with the gentlest of intentions and allowing people to speak as they naturally did when they forgot she was listening. The walk to Elmwood House took her along the quieter side of the village, past tall hedges and neatly trimmed lawns. The air held a faint chill, unusual for this early in the day, and the sky wore a pale grey veil that hinted rain might come later. As she approached the great iron gates, she noticed they were parted just enough for a single person to pass through without fuss. A careless oversight, or perhaps someone had left in haste. She let herself in with a soft, unobtrusive step and followed the gravel path to the front entrance, where the door opened before she could lift a hand to knock. Clara Pennington stood there, looking more drawn than the day before. Her apron was only half-tied, and wisps of hair escaped her neat bun. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, startled. Good morning. Good morning, my dear. I was taking a walk and thought I might inquire after Mrs. Harborough. I imagine she has had a trying night. Clara hesitated only a moment before stepping aside. She's in the morning room. I suppose she would be glad of company. Miss Marple entered the grand foyer, its polished floors gleaming like still water. It was a house meant for confidence and social display, yet a faint tension clung to the air, as though the very walls were bracing for unpleasant truths. Clara led her down a corridor, pausing before a half-open door. "She hasn't eaten," the girl whispered. "I tried bringing her a tray, but she sent it back untouched." "That is most worrisome," Miss Marple murmured. "Thank you, Clara." She knocked lightly and entered. Mrs. Harborough sat by the window, her elegant posture wilted, her fingers tracing the embroidered edge of a cushion. The pale morning light softened her features, but nothing could soften the exhaustion shadowing her eyes. She looked up with a start. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect visitors." "I won't intrude if now is not convenient," Miss Marple said gently. "I only wish to offer my sympathy." A tremor passed over the widow's face. "You're kind, far kinder than most. Already the village has begun to speculate." "Villagers do," Miss Marple said, settling into a nearby chair with the quiet ease of someone accustomed to being overlooked. "It is their nature." Mrs. Harborough gave a mirthless smile. "I suppose you know they think I had something to do with Adrian's death." "I believe," Miss Marple replied softly, "that people struggle with the idea that tragedy can come from places they do not easily see. They look for simple explanations." "And you?" Mrs. Harborough's gaze sharpened. "Do you think I—" "No," Miss Marple answered with surprising firmness. "I think you are a woman carrying a great many burdens, and it is often those who suffer quietly who appear guilty to those who do not understand suffering." The widow inhaled shakily, her composure cracking. She pressed a hand to her forehead. "Adrian should not have come. I told him, but it hardly matters now." "It may matter very much," Miss Marple said, repeating her thought from the night before. "You needn't tell me anything you do not wish to. But secrets, you know, they have a way of demanding attention." Mrs. Harborough let out a brittle laugh. "My secret has already demanded far too much." Before Miss Marple could inquire further, a heavy footstep echoed down the corridor. The door swung open abruptly, and Inspector Arkwright appeared, cap in hand, looking more harassed than usual. "Ah, Miss Marple, I might have known," he grunted before turning to the widow. "Mrs. Harborough, I'm afraid I must trouble you with more questions." She stiffened, the fragile moment shattered. "Must we do this now?" "I'm afraid so. There are details that need clarifying." Miss Marple rose. "Inspector, perhaps it would be best if—" No, Arkwright interrupted. "You may stay if the lady prefers it." Mrs. Harborough, without lifting her eyes, nodded faintly. "Miss Marple may remain." The inspector cleared his throat. "Now then, we've confirmed Mr. Brent was poisoned by ingestion, something he consumed not long before he collapsed, which means the act occurred at the feet." The widow's eyes widened in horror. "I never gave him anything to eat or drink there." "That's what I'm trying to establish," Arkwright said. "Several witnesses saw you speaking with him shortly before the incident." "That is a lie!" she burst out, then pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "Forgive me. It's just not true. I wasn't with him. I was at the charity table the entire time." "Mrs. Briggs claims otherwise." "Hester Briggs claims anything that will put her at the center of attention." Arkwright frowned. "Be that as it may, the timing is suspicious. And then there's the matter of the argument you had with him earlier that day." Mrs. Harborough flinched. "Clara must have mentioned that, but it wasn't an argument. It was a difficult conversation." "A conversation about what?" She shook her head violently. "I can't. Not yet." Arkwright's jaw tightened. "This would go much more smoothly if you cooperated." Miss Marple stepped forward. "Inspector, might I suggest that pressing A distressed woman seldom produces clarity. Perhaps if Mrs. Harborough explained the nature of her acquaintance with Mr. Brent, it would shed light on events. The widow stared at Miss Marple for a long moment, then looked away. He was my late husband's cousin, distant but close enough that they shared business matters. Arkwright pounced. Business matters? Meaning debts, disputes, threats? No, nothing like that. But Adrian believed my husband left behind unresolved affairs. He wanted to review certain documents. I told him it wasn't a good time, that I wasn't prepared. Miss Marple watched closely. This was true, partly, but it wasn't the whole of it. And these documents, Arkwright continued, might they have given someone reason to harm Mr. Brent? Mrs. Harborough shook her head helplessly. I don't know. I don't know anything anymore. Very well, the inspector said with a reluctant sigh. We will speak again soon. He turned and left, the door closing heavily behind him. Silence fell like a dense curtain. Finally, Miss Marple spoke, her voice gentle. My dear, whatever shadows trouble you, they grow larger when you face them alone. Mrs. Harborough whispered, I don't know who to trust. Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. Trust, I find, is less important than truth, and truth has a way of revealing itself, if one is patient. She rose to leave, but before she reached the door, she paused. One more thing, if I may. Where were the documents you mentioned kept? The widow lifted her head slowly. In my husband's old study. And has anything been disturbed there recently? Mrs. Harborough hesitated. I don't know. I haven't been in that room since Adrian arrived. Miss Marple offered a kind nod. Perhaps it's time someone had a look. She left Elmwood House with a growing certainty that whatever lay hidden in that study would prove vital. For secrets, like yew roots, were rarely content to stay buried, and someone had already killed to protect one. Miss Marple left Elmwood House with a sense of quiet determination. The morning sun had burned off the thin mist, leaving the village streets glistening, and the brisk air was filled with the distant sound of birdsong. Yet, despite the outward calm, the weight of the previous night's revelations hung over her like a persistent shadow. She knew that understanding the subtleties of human behavior was far more critical than chasing superficial evidence. The movements, reactions, and interactions of those around her often told more than words or confessions ever could. And in a case as delicate as this, every nuance mattered. She paused briefly near the village square, noting the soft murmur of gossip beginning to circulate. Shopkeepers leaned on counters, exchanging glances and hushed speculations, while Mrs. Briggs and a few other ladies of the community walked briskly past, muttering about what they believed had transpired. Miss Marple, however, paid little attention to the conjecture, focusing instead on the subtleties, the hesitation in voices, the fleeting glances, the way people positioned themselves in relation to one another. Patterns were emerging, though they were faint and required careful observation to recognize. Her first stop was the small tea shop on the corner, a hub where information often surfaced unconsciously. The proprietor, Mrs. Whitaker, greeted her warmly but with a peculiar edge of caution. Miss Marple, she said, lowering her voice slightly, you'll want to hear what I've heard about last night. People are saying all sorts of things and, well, it's getting quite out of hand. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea with polite gratitude and asked, What sort of things, Mrs. Whitaker? Oh, you know how it is. Someone saw Mr. Cartwright near the garden gate, and others claim he left in such a hurry that he must be hiding something. And then there's the matter of the missing notebook. People are saying it was stolen, and everyone's looking for someone to blame. Mrs. Whitaker's hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea, betraying the anxiety that ran beneath the surface of her civility. Miss Marple sipped slowly, letting the warmth settle her thoughts. And did anyone notice anything unusual about the garden itself? Disturbances or footprints? She inquired, careful to phrase the question without suggesting foreknowledge. Mrs. Whittaker's eyes widened. Well, yes, now you mention it. The gardener seemed quite flustered this morning. He was pacing near the sundial, muttering about something being out of place. Most people dismissed it, thinking he was simply nervous, but I noticed him touching the ground as if he was looking for something. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed subtly. Interesting, she murmured. The sundial had been mentioned before, but this was the first indication that someone else had noticed unusual activity around it. Small details such as these often revealed the patterns of movement and opportunity that were invisible to casual observers. As she left the tea shop, Miss Marple reflected on the day's tasks. She needed to retrace Evelyn's steps carefully, from Elmwood House to the sundial and back, noting any points where interactions with others might have influenced her choices. She also considered the timing, when Evelyn had spoken with Finch, when she had left the house, and when she might have been intercepted. The window of opportunity for the perpetrator had been narrow but deliberate, requiring knowledge of both the household and Evelyn's habits. Her next stop was the village post office. Letters had been a recurring thread in the events leading up to Evelyn's death, particularly correspondence between Adrian Brent and Mr. Cartwright. Miss Marple approached the counter, where Mr. Dobbins, the postmaster, greeted her, cautiously. "Miss Marple, I hear troubling news," he said. "People are anxious, as always, when anything untoward happens. And there's been more gossip than letters this morning." Miss Marple inquired gently about any letters or parcels that might have been sent to Elmwood House or received from outside in the last week. Mr. Dobbins hesitated, then revealed that a registered envelope had arrived for Mr. Cartwright 2 days ago, but had not been collected until yesterday morning. The handwriting was unfamiliar, suggesting someone outside the immediate circle of the estate. Miss Marple noted the timing carefully. It coincided with Evelyn's increasing unease in the conversations she had had with the gardener. Letters could have contained threats, instructions, or information that altered the course of events. Returning toward Elmwood House, Miss Marple considered the broader web of relationships in the village. Who had opportunity, motive, and knowledge? She thought of the tensions that had been bubbling quietly. Cartwright's evident anxiety, the widow's sorrow and concern over unresolved family matters, and the subtle unease among the household staff. Each character was a piece of the larger puzzle, revealing motivations that were as hidden as they were complex. When she arrived back at the estate, she paused at the sundial, noting its unchanged position in the fading light. It stood as a silent witness, as it had all along, to the movements and intentions of those who had crossed its shadow. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the hollow at its base, recalling Finch's confession about Evelyn kneeling there and handling something of importance. The earth was undisturbed now, yet the memory of movement and purpose remained indelibly etched in her mind. Clara appeared suddenly, carrying a small bundle. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "I found this tucked in the conservatory. I didn't think it meant anything, but—" She unfolded a leather-bound notebook. Miss Marple's heart quickened slightly, not for surprise, but for the affirmation it provided. The notebook, the missing piece of Evelyn's intentions, was now back in play. Whoever had removed it had acted carefully, but perhaps not carefully enough to prevent it from resurfacing. Miss Marple opened the notebook delicately, leafing through the pages filled with Evelyn's neat handwriting. It contained observations, records of conversations, and notes regarding her late husband's estate and unresolved matters with Adrian Brent. The final entry mentioned a planned meeting at the sundial and the anticipation of discussing delicate information with an unnamed party. Miss Marple's mind connected the dots. The meeting, the notebook, the removed notes, and the disturbed earth, all signs pointing toward a carefully orchestrated encounter, one intended to conceal as much as it revealed. She turned to Clara. "You have done well. Leave this here for the inspector. It will be important when we question the household further." Clara nodded, her relief palpable. though Miss Marple could sense the lingering tension that would take longer to ease. As night approached, Miss Marple walked slowly around the estate, reviewing her thoughts. The threads of motive, opportunity, and human behavior were now clearer, though not yet complete. She realized that the coming hours would require patient observation, subtle questioning, and careful attention to reactions. The answers were close, she knew, hidden not in blunt evidence but in the patterns of thought and behavior, the tremors of fear and anxiety, and the quiet ways in which people betrayed their intentions without realizing it. The shadows lengthened across the garden, and Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She understood, as always, that a mystery was not a matter of haste, but of careful, deliberate observation. The truth of what had transpired at Elmwood House was gradually revealing itself, and the next step would bring the web of secrets into sharper focus. There, beneath the layers of human behavior, she would finally discern the path that led to Evelyn's untimely death, and the one responsible for it. Inspector Graves paused at the threshold of Evelyn's room, his hand resting on the polished brass doorknob as though he half expected the young woman to reappear and chastise him for intruding. The house felt unnaturally still, the hush deepened by the distant ticking of a grandfather clock below. Miss Marple, who had followed with the soft, unobtrusive tread of someone accustomed to being overlooked, waited patiently beside him. She did not comment on his hesitation. She merely folded her gloved hands and observed the slight tremor in the curtain beside the landing window, as though a draught revealed the unsettled state of the household itself. When Graves exhaled sharply and pushed the door open, she entered behind him with quiet dignity. Evelyn's room was neat, almost unnaturally so. A floral coverlet stretched taut across the bed. No book left open on the bedside table, no slippers askew on the rug. Graves muttered that such tidiness could be the hallmark of someone with little time for comfort, or someone who guarded her privacy with care. Miss Marple merely noted that the vase of lilies on the dressing table had not wilted evenly. One bloom drooped far more than the others, suggesting it had been handled, perhaps plucked out and replaced. She did not voice the thought, only moved closer to inspect the faint ring of displaced dust around the vase's base. Something had indeed been moved recently. Graves began opening drawers with the solemnity of a man both searching for answers and fearing what he might find. The top drawer contained folded blouses and a faint scent of lavender sachets. The next held personal letters, bound with ribbon in careful bundles. Miss Marple hovered near the writing desk, her attention drawn not to the obvious, the neat rows of envelopes and ink bottle, but to the small indentation in the blotter, a narrow groove suggesting something rectangular had rested there for some time. When she lightly brushed her fingertips across it, she recognized that such marks were left by objects opened and closed frequently. A diary, perhaps, or more likely the slim notebook Clara had mentioned. Graves, continuing his search, soon discovered an empty slot in the bookshelf where dust outlined the shape of a missing volume. He held up the surrounding books, muttering titles. Evelyn seemed to favor poetry and accounts of rural history, nothing suggestive of scandal or blackmail. Yet the gap felt significant, as though the missing book had not been removed casually, but taken with intent. Miss Marple, with polite understatement, observed that the gap's dimensions matched the indentation on the blotter. Graves, startled by her perceptiveness, conceded she might be right. As the inspector rifled further, Miss Marple crossed to the window. Outside, the garden stretched in perfect symmetry, yet the sundial Clara had mentioned stood at a curious angle, a fact Miss Marple found peculiarly instructive. Weather alone seldom shifted heavy stone structures, but a hurried hand might. She wondered what Evelyn had intended to hide or retrieve there in her final hours. Behind her, a soft grunt signaled that Graves had discovered something new, a torn scrap of paper wedged behind the wardrobe. He extracted it with difficulty, his brow furrowing as he read the half-visible words. Meet sundial. Before any... The rest was ripped away. He speculated whether Evelyn had written the note or whether it had been addressed to her, but Miss Marple's attention had already shifted to the tear pattern. Jagged, quick, torn by someone in haste or distress. She suggested, with gentle tact, that the missing notebook might contain the complete version of the message. Graves groaned, running a hand through his hair, for the absence of the notebook complicated matters. If someone had taken it, then that person either feared what it contained or required it for leverage. Either way, they were now part of the investigation. Descending the stairs with somber purpose, they found Mrs. Aldridge in the drawing-room, anxiously twisting a handkerchief. At the sight of Miss Marple, her eyes brimmed with a desperate appeal. She confessed that she had overheard a conversation between Evelyn and Mr. Cartwright the previous evening, conducted in harsh whispers near the library door. Evelyn had sounded frightened, Cartwright evasive. Mrs. Aldridge had not caught the content, only the rising tension. Graves immediately scribbled the account into his notebook, while Miss Marple inquired whether Evelyn had seemed upset afterward. Mrs. Aldridge nodded vigorously, saying the young woman had retired early, muttering something about settling matters at last. Before Graves could ask further questions, young Clara appeared again, breathless and flustered. She revealed that Mr. Finch, the gardener, had been near the sundial that morning and had seemed unusually nervous when she mentioned Evelyn's death. Graves seized on the detail and requested Finch's whereabouts. While a constable went to fetch him, Miss Marple quietly asked Clara what exactly she had said to provoke Finch's reaction. Clara repeated her words. She had mentioned Evelyn's pale face, her tension, her disappearance from the fete. Finch had stiffened, stammered, and dropped his pruning shears. Finch arrived moments later, cap in hand, eyes darting uneasily between Graves and Miss Marple. His hands bore soil under the nails, but Miss Marple noticed more, the faintest trace of reddened skin along his wrist, as though from brushing against a thorny hedge in haste. Graves immediately questioned him about the sundial. Finch admitted he had been there, but claimed it was merely part of his duties to tidy the grounds. Miss Marple, in her soft, kindly voice, asked whether he had ever seen Evelyn near the sundial in recent days. The question caught him off guard. He hesitated, swallowed, then confessed that he had seen her there 2 nights ago, kneeling as if placing something beneath the stone. He had watched from a distance, unsure whether to approach. Graves leaned forward sharply, demanding why he had not reported this sooner. Finch faltered, saying he feared being suspected himself, as he had quarreled with Evelyn earlier that week over the removal of a wilting rose bush she had insisted he spare. Miss Marple's eyes softened, recognizing that guilt of temperament was easily mistaken for guilt of deed. Still, Finch's revelation drew the investigation in a new direction. The sundial now loomed larger in Miss Marple's thoughts. Someone else, too, had understood its significance. Someone who had moved it, retrieved something from it, or hidden something there. And as the shadows deepened across the room, it was clear that the secrets buried beneath Elmwood's surface were beginning to stir, each detail threading itself subtly into a larger tapestry she could almost perceive, but not yet fully grasp. Inspector Graves wasted no time in ordering Finch to accompany them to the garden, though the man's reluctant shuffle suggested he would far rather be anywhere else. Miss Marple followed a few steps behind, her gaze drifting thoughtfully from Finch's stiff shoulders to the windows overhead, where faint outlines of curious household staff could be seen peering through the curtains. It was always in moments of heightened tension, she reflected, that people revealed more of themselves than they intended. The path toward the sundial was lined with clipped hedges and autumn roses, their petals beginning to curl at the edges. Finch kept his eyes on the gravel, but Miss Marple noticed how he flinched at every crunch beneath his boots, as though the very earth betrayed him. Graves, meanwhile, strode ahead with a resolute march, glancing back only when he reached the sundial itself. The stone structure looked deceptively ordinary, its shadow cast cleanly across the engraved hours, yet the ground around it bore subtle signs of recent disturbance. Graves knelt, brushing aside a thin layer of soil to reveal marks that could easily have been left by hurried hands or a small tool. Finch cleared his throat nervously and insisted he had touched nothing. Graves shot him a stern look but reserved judgment. Miss Marple bent with some difficulty, her fingers tracing the faint outline of a slightly raised stone at the sundial's base. She pointed it out gently, prompting Graves to pry it loose. Underneath lay a small hollow, empty now but lined with compacted earth that hinted at something recently placed there. Graves muttered a curse under his breath. Finch blanched, rubbing his wrists anxiously, though Miss Marple noted that his expression held more fear than guilt. She, with characteristic mildness, suggested that whatever had been hidden there might have been removed shortly after Evelyn's death, or possibly even before it, depending on who knew of its existence. Finch looked relieved at her words, though Graves remained rigid with suspicion. Before Finch could be questioned further, they were interrupted by the approach of Mrs. Aldridge, who hurried down the path with her skirt gathered in one hand and a look of palpable distress on her face. She announced breathlessly that Mr. Cartwright had left the estate in a rush, claiming he needed to clear his head. Graves stiffened, immediately equating the flight with guilt, but Miss Marple merely tilted her head as though assessing a more nuanced meaning. She suspected Cartwright capable of panic, but his departure did not necessarily signal a murderer's escape, only a troubled man with something to hide. Graves instructed the constable to send word to the station, urging them to track Cartwright's movements. Meanwhile, Miss Marple turned her attention back to the hollow beneath the sundial. She found herself recalling Clara's mention of the notebook beneath Evelyn's shawl and the indentation on the writing desk. If the notebook had been hidden here and later retrieved, the question became who would benefit from possessing it. The murderer, perhaps, or someone afraid of being implicated in a wider scandal. As they made their way back toward the house, Finch lingered behind until Miss Marple drew alongside him. With gentle patience, she asked whether Evelyn had entrusted him with any messages or requests in the days before her death. Finch hesitated but eventually admitted that she had asked him about the stability of the sundial, whether it could be moved easily. He had told her it was heavy, but not immovable. Miss Marple thanked him softly, her eyes warming with a mix of sympathy and reassurance that left the poor man visibly comforted. She knew that small kindnesses often open the door to deeper truths. Inside the house, the atmosphere had grown more strained. Servants whispered in corners, and Mrs. Aldridge wrung her hands as she explained that Cartwright had seemed increasingly agitated in recent weeks. He had received letters that distressed him, though she had not seen their contents. Miss Marple watched Graves latch on to the new information, his suspicion toward Cartwright growing keener by the moment. Clara reappeared, this time holding a folded handkerchief she claimed to have found near the back staircase. The initials embroidered at the corner, ER, belonged to Evelyn. Graves took the item with guarded interest, but Miss Marple's attention lingered not on the handkerchief itself, but on Clara's faintly trembling hands. The girl insisted she had no idea how it ended up in such a location, though she admitted she rarely ventured to that part of the house. Miss Marple, noting Clara's sincerity, gently asked what had drawn her there now. Clara confessed in a hush that she thought she had heard someone moving about earlier, though when she checked, no one had been present. Graves dismissed the detail as nerves, but Miss Marple did not. The back staircase, she recalled, led toward the older, less used portion of the estate, a place where secrets might easily linger. She suggested they investigate, and though Graves balked at chasing shadows, he relented when she pointed out how the smallest oversight might delay understanding Evelyn's final hours. The staircase creaked beneath their feet as they ascended, the dim corridor above lit only by a narrow window near the far end. dust coated the floor, save for a faint trail disturbed by recent passage. Graves crouched to examine it, while Miss Marple, lingering behind, let her gaze travel along the walls and doors. One door near the end hung slightly ajar, just enough to suggest it had been opened recently, though not fully closed afterward. When Graves pushed it open, they found a small sitting room, long abandoned, save for a single wooden chair positioned near the fireplace. On it rested a thin strip of torn fabric. Graves lifted it, comparing its edge to the tear on the scrap of paper recovered from Evelyn's room. The frayed pattern matched precisely. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, not with triumph, but with an aching sense of inevitability. Someone had been here, a person familiar enough with Elmwood's forgotten corners to use them unnoticed. As Graves bagged the fabric, Miss Marple touched the back of the chair lightly, noting how recently it had been used. A faint warmth lingered. Whoever had sat there might have left minutes before they arrived, listening perhaps, or waiting for the right moment to move unseen. The realization settled like a chill in her bones. The truth was closer now, and far more perilous than the household dared to imagine. Inspector Graves wasted no time in ordering Finch to accompany them to the garden, though the man's reluctant shuffle suggested he would far rather be anywhere else. Miss Marple followed a few steps behind, her gaze drifting thoughtfully from Finch's stiff shoulders to the windows overhead where faint outlines of curious household staff could be seen peering through the curtains. It was always in moments of heightened tension, she reflected, that people revealed more of themselves than they intended. The path toward the sundial was lined with clipped hedges and autumn roses, their petals beginning to curl at the edges. Finch kept his eyes on the gravel, but Miss Marple noticed how he flinched at every crunch beneath his boots, as though the very earth betrayed him. Graves, meanwhile, strode ahead with a resolute march, glancing back only when he reached the sundial itself. The stone structure looked deceptively ordinary, its shadow cast cleanly across the engraved hours. Yet the ground around it bore subtle signs of recent disturbance. Graves knelt, brushing aside a thin layer of soil to reveal marks that could easily have been left by hurried hands or a small tool. Finch cleared his throat nervously and insisted he had touched nothing. Graves shot him a stern look but reserved judgment. Miss Marple bent with some difficulty, her fingers tracing the faint outline of a slightly raised stone at the sundial's base. She pointed it out gently, prompting Graves to pry it loose. Underneath lay a small hollow, empty now but lined with compacted earth that hinted at something recently placed there. Graves muttered a curse under his breath. Finch blanched, rubbing his wrists anxiously, though Miss Marple noted that his expression held more fear than guilt. She, with characteristic mildness, suggested that whatever had been hidden there might have been removed shortly after Evelyn's death, or possibly even before it, depending on who knew of its existence. Finch looked relieved at her words, though Graves remained rigid with suspicion. Before Finch could be questioned further, they were interrupted by the approach of Mrs. Aldridge, who hurried down the path with her skirt gathered in one hand and a look of palpable distress on her face. She announced breathlessly that Mr. Cartwright had left the estate in a rush, claiming he needed to clear his head. Graves stiffened, immediately equating the flight with guilt, but Miss Marple merely tilted her head as though assessing a more nuanced meaning. She suspected Cartwright capable of panic, but his departure did not necessarily signal a murderer's escape. Only a troubled man with something to hide. Graves instructed the constable to send word to the station, urging them to track Cartwright's movements. Meanwhile, Miss Marple turned her attention back to the hollow beneath the sundial. She found herself recalling Clara's mention of the notebook beneath Evelyn's shawl and the indentation on the writing desk. If the notebook had been hidden here and later retrieved, the question became who would benefit from possessing it? The murderer, perhaps, or someone afraid of being implicated in a wider scandal. As they made their way back toward the house, Finch lingered behind until Miss Marple drew alongside him. With gentle patience, she asked whether Evelyn had entrusted him with any messages or requests in the days before her death. Finch hesitated, but eventually admitted that she had asked him about the stability of the sundial, whether it could be moved easily. He had told her it was heavy, but not immovable. Miss Marple thanked him softly, her eyes warming with a mix of sympathy and reassurance that left the poor man visibly comforted. She knew that small kindnesses often open the door to deeper truths. Inside the house, the atmosphere had grown more strained. Servants whispered in corners, and Mrs. Aldridge wrung her hands as she explained that Cartwright had seemed increasingly agitated in recent weeks. He had received letters that distressed him, though she had not seen their contents. Miss Marple watched Graves latch on to the new information, his suspicion toward Cartwright growing keener by the moment. Clara reappeared, this time holding a folded handkerchief she claimed to have found near the back staircase. The initials embroidered at the corner, E.R., belonged to Evelyn. Graves took the item with guarded interest, but Miss Marple's attention lingered not on the handkerchief itself, but on Clara's faintly trembling hands. The girl insisted she had no idea how it ended up in such a location, though she admitted she rarely ventured to that part of the house. Miss Marple, noting Clara's sincerity, gently asked what had drawn her there now. Clara confessed in a hush that she thought she had heard someone moving about earlier, though when she checked, no one had been present. Graves dismissed the detail as nerves, but Miss Marple did not. The back staircase, she recalled, led toward the older, less used portion of the estate, a place where secrets might easily linger. She suggested they investigate, and though Graves balked at chasing shadows, he relented when she pointed out how the smallest oversight might delay understanding Evelyn's final hours. The staircase creaked beneath their feet as they ascended, the dim corridor above lit only by a narrow window near the far end. Dust coated the floor, save for a faint trail disturbed by recent passage. Graves crouched to examine it, while Miss Marple, lingering behind, let her gaze travel along the walls and doors. One door near the end hung slightly ajar, just enough to suggest it had been opened recently, though not fully closed afterward. When Graves pushed it open, they found a small sitting room long abandoned, save for a single wooden chair positioned near the fireplace. On it rested a thin strip of torn fabric. Graves lifted it, comparing its edge to the tear on the scrap of paper recovered from Evelyn's room. The frayed pattern matched precisely. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, not with triumph, but with an aching sense of inevitability. Someone had been here, a person familiar enough with Elmwood's forgotten corners to use them unnoticed, and she knew the truth was drawing steadily nearer. Miss Marple stood quietly, her eyes fixed on the chair by the fireplace, her mind turning over each detail she had observed in the house and the garden. The hollow beneath the sundial, the missing notebook, the fragment of paper torn from Evelyn's room, all pointed to one conclusion. Someone had been orchestrating movements behind the scenes with a careful hand, and the fact that the missing notebook had not yet surfaced suggested it was now in the possession of the person most invested in controlling the narrative of Evelyn's last hours. The question remained: who, and for what reason? Inspector Graves, pacing the narrow confines of the sitting room, broke the silence. Miss Marple, do you think we should question the household again? Perhaps someone saw something they didn't think significant at the time. Miss Marple, however, shook her head gently. I believe, she said, her voice measured, that what we need is not more questions, but careful listening. People often reveal more by what they attempt to conceal than by what they say outright. Graves sighed, but made no objection. Miss Marple's reputation for uncovering subtle truths had been proven before, and he had learned, reluctantly, to respect her instincts. She moved toward the window and peered through the dusty glass at the garden beyond. The sundial now seemed less a mere ornament than a stage set for clandestine actions. She recalled Finch's admission that Evelyn had tested its stability and the way Clara had described seeing him near it that morning. The gardener's nervousness, combined with the disturbed soil, indicated that the sundial had been more than a mere hiding place. It was a rendezvous point, a locus for secrets. Miss Marple turned her attention to the back staircase, leading toward the older wing of the house. The faint trail of dust that Graves had noted earlier suggested that someone had moved through here recently, and the room they had just examined was too deliberate in its arrangement to be coincidental. She observed the subtle signs, the chair's position, the fragment of fabric carefully placed on it, the absence of personal items that should have been present. Someone had meant for the room to appear abandoned, yet their intent was betrayed by the smallest details. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft creak of the door. Clara entered hesitantly, clutching a folded envelope. "Miss Marple, I found this tucked beneath one of the cushions in the sitting room. I didn't touch anything else." Her eyes were wide with concern. Miss Marple took the envelope delicately, noting that the handwriting matched the fragment from Evelyn's room. Carefully, she opened it and read the brief message inside. "Meet me at the sundial before anyone notices. Urgent." The note confirmed her suspicions. Evelyn had planned a secret meeting at the sundial, likely to retrieve or deliver something of significance. Miss Marple's mind considered the possibilities. The notebook, letters, perhaps even evidence of some prior scandal that Adrian Brent had hoped to exploit or resolve. The note's urgency suggested that Evelyn had been apprehensive, aware that someone might interfere with her intentions. Graves, standing behind her, peered over her shoulder. "So, someone was meeting her there," he said. "And that's when—" He gestured vaguely toward the garden, implying the moment of death. Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely. But we cannot assume the person who expected to meet her is the one who caused her death. There is a third element here: opportunity and motive. The sundial meeting indicates planning. The removal of the notebook indicates deliberate concealment. The question is, who had the means to act undetected?" Graves frowned. "That could be anyone in the house, or even someone from outside." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "But the evidence narrows the field. Consider the fabric fragment, the hollow beneath the sundial, Finch's behavior, the torn note, and the timing of Mr. Cartwright's departure. These are not random, they are threads in a single tapestry." Clara, still lingering, wrung her hands. "Do you think it was Mr. Cartwright? He left so suddenly, and he always seemed strange lately." Miss Marple studied the girl carefully. "Cartwright is certainly a possibility, but the truth seldom resides in the most obvious place. Remember, Clara, people often react in ways that draw suspicion even when they are innocent, while the guilty move in subtler patterns." Graves interjected impatiently. "Well, we need some hard evidence. How are we to catch someone on such delicate traces?" Miss Marple considered this, then suggested, "Sometimes, Inspector, the evidence is in observing reactions. One must create circumstances under which the person responsible cannot help but reveal themselves, often without realizing they are doing so." Graves blinked, not entirely following, but Miss Marple's calm certainty reminded him that patience was essential. She turned to the envelope again, noting the precise fold and the subtle pressure points along its edges. "Whoever wrote this," she murmured, "was familiar with both Evelyn and the layout of the house. They knew she would trust a hidden meeting and had the confidence to assume no one would observe. And that," Miss Marple continued, "is why it is crucial to understand not only who had motive, but who had knowledge. Knowledge of the sundial, of the house's habits, and of Evelyn's routines. That narrows our suspects significantly." Graves rubbed his forehead, muttering about timelines and statements. Miss Marple, however, had already begun forming a mental map, the sundial as a locus, the hollow as concealment, the note as evidence of intention and the fragment as a subtle signal left behind, perhaps accidentally, by the guilty party. There were layers here, layers that must be unraveled in order, lest they missed the subtle psychological cues that would reveal the perpetrator. She rose from the chair, her face calm yet purposeful. "Inspector, we shall need to gather the household once more and observe carefully. Each reaction, each hesitation, each seemingly trivial remark may be more illuminating than any confession." Graves nodded, reluctantly trusting her judgment. "Very well, but I hope you realize the time window may be closing." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered with quiet confidence. "Time, Inspector, is exactly what we have. For in every deception, there is a moment when the truth becomes unavoidable, and we need only recognize it." With that, she left the sitting room, footsteps soft, leaving Graves and Clara to contemplate the fragile threads that were slowly weaving themselves into the outline of revelation. Outside, the autumn wind rustled the hedges, as if urging secrets to the surface, and Miss Marple knew the next hours would bring to light what had long lurked in the shadows of Elmwood House. Miss Marple gathered the household in the drawing-room as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the carpet. Inspector Graves stood stiffly to one side, his notebook clutched in hand, ready to record anything that might arise. The villagers and staff, summoned at Miss Marple's discretion, shifted uneasily, each face a mask of polite curiosity or faint apprehension. The widow, Mrs. Harborough, sat nearest to the window, hands clasped tightly in her lap, her composure carefully reconstructed but her eyes betraying a lingering unease. Miss Marple moved quietly to the center, allowing the room's tension to settle into her familiar calm. "My friends," she began, her voice soft but carrying a steady authority, "we have all been unsettled by the tragedy of Adrian Brent's death. I know suspicion weighs heavily, and accusations, whether spoken or unspoken, have already made the rounds." She paused, allowing the murmur of unease to ripple across the room. "But the truth is seldom found in haste. It lies in observation, in small details, and in human behavior, rather than in assumptions alone." She turned her gaze to Mr. Finch, the gardener, whose recent revelations had proven vital. "Mr. Finch, you saw Evelyn at the sundial 2 nights ago. You noticed her handling something hidden beneath it. That observation, though you feared reproach, was important." Finch bowed his head, nervous. I only saw her kneeling there, miss. I didn't touch anything." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied gently. "But there is more. We know that Evelyn had a notebook, something she valued enough to hide under her shawl and later to plan its retrieval at the sundial. It is missing. Someone took it deliberately. That is the point of our inquiry. Who had both the knowledge and the motive to act in secret?" The room fell silent, each person weighing their own conscience. Miss Marple's eyes swept over them, pausing briefly on Clara, Mrs. Aldridge, and finally on a man who had remained quiet through much of the questioning, Mr. Cartwright. His abrupt departure earlier had drawn suspicion, but it was the subtlety of his manner, the nervous way he adjusted his cuff-links, the almost imperceptible tension in his jaw, that made him stand out to Miss Marple. She allowed the silence to build. "Now, consider the torn note discovered in Evelyn's room. It instructed her to meet someone at the sundial urgently. Yet when we examined the hollow beneath the sundial, it was empty. This indicates 2 things. First, the meeting was anticipated, and second, the person expecting her had the opportunity to remove the item she intended to retrieve." Her gaze sharpened. Evelyn did not meet her end by chance. She was confronted, poisoned deliberately with you, carefully prepared, signifying knowledge and forethought. Who, then, would have such knowledge, and who would benefit from the removal of her notebook? A quiet cough broke the tension as Miss Marple's eyes fixed on Cartwright. "Mr. Cartwright, you received letters from Adrian Brent, letters which distressed you. You knew of Evelyn's intentions, her meetings, and her concern regarding old matters from her late husband's estate. You also knew of the sundial's hollow, as you had observed the grounds, studied the estate, and anticipated Evelyn's movements. She paused, letting the room absorb the implication. You attempted to manipulate events, confident that no one would notice the smallest clues you left behind. Yet you did not reckon with the perception of human behavior over mere appearances. Cartwright's face drained of color. "That is preposterous. Miss Marple interjected softly, almost soothingly. "Consider the details you could not control. The torn scrap of paper from Evelyn's room, which you attempted to remove but left behind. The fabric fragment in the sitting room, torn as you hastily retrieved the notebook. The reaction of Mr. Finch, who saw you lingering near the sundial before Evelyn's arrival. And finally, your sudden departure, which you intended to disguise as distress, yet revealed your own anxiety. All these are patterns in behavior, Mr. Cartwright, and you overlooked them." Cartwright stammered, unable to find words, while Inspector Graves stepped forward, the weight of confirmation settling on his shoulders. Miss Marple continued, "You poisoned Adrian Brent not out of mere anger, but to prevent him from revealing matters from the past, matters tied to the estate and the legacy of Mrs. Harborough's late husband. Evelyn, seeking to protect or perhaps clarify those same matters, became an obstacle. You acted in fear, calculating your opportunity meticulously, yet underestimated the quiet observations of those around you." Cartwright sank into a nearby chair, defeated as Graves moved to restrain him. The tension in the room, so long palpable, shifted as though a heavy curtain had been drawn aside, revealing clarity in the once shadowed affairs of Elmwood House. The assembled witnesses exchanged astonished glances, realizing that the intricate web of secrecy, suspicion, and misdirection had been patiently untangled by one who observed not only actions, but the human mind itself. Miss Marple turned gently to Mrs. Harborough, offering a reassuring smile. "The truth has now been revealed. It is, I think, the first step toward restoring peace, however imperfectly, to this household. While the motives were hidden and the methods insidious, justice will follow its proper course." The widow nodded, tears in her eyes, a mixture of relief and sorrow reflecting the gravity of the past days. Inspector Graves, still catching his breath, looked to Miss Marple. "I must admit, your deductions, your attention to subtle details and behavior, have solved what we might have spent months untangling. You have our deepest thanks." Miss Marple inclined her head with quiet modesty. "Observation, Inspector, is a practice that rewards patience. The human heart is often the most revealing document of all. We need only learn to read it carefully." The household slowly dispersed, some lingering to whisper reassurances to one another, others moving with the solemnity of those who had witnessed a crime resolved. Outside, the evening sky deepened to amber and violet, the garden glowing in the soft light of dusk. Miss Marple lingered by the window, reflecting on the nature of secrecy and the fragile illusions of ordinary life. Even in a village as seemingly peaceful as Little Brynford, old grievances and hidden intentions could erupt in tragedy, but they could also be understood when one cared to watch closely. As she finally turned to leave Elmwood House, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, contemplative smile. Life, she knew, would return to its quiet rhythms, yet the lesson remained. Beneath the calm exterior of even the most unassuming places, shadows lingered, waiting for the careful observer to bring them into the light. And in those shadows, human nature, with all its complexity, revealed truths far more telling than any superficial evidence ever could. The mystery of Elmwood House was at last resolved, its threads drawn together, and yet the echoes of human frailty and ambition would linger in the minds of those who had witnessed both its peril and its unraveling. In that delicate balance, Miss Marple quietly understood, lay the true measure of justice.